I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Sergio Pellis. He's a professor of neuroscience at the University of Lethbridge and an expert on the neurobiology of play, which we're going to be talking about today. Sergio, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thank you.
I
Thanks for
mentioned that I did a deep dive last year on Panksepp's work, which, to my knowledge, although this could be incorrect, was the first neuroscientist to study play empirically, rigorously in rodents, or maybe in any species.
yeah. He was he spearheaded the search. I mean, there were other people around the time he started that were also dabbling in the area, but he really put it on the map as a worthwhile thing to study.
Have you heard of the psychologist Jordan Peterson?
No, no.
So he's lectured about this. He's a great lecturer, and that's where I first heard of Panksepp's work on play. And he's a really entertaining lecturer because he made it sound like, you're getting like these $1 million NSF grants to do all this complicated neuroscience research. And some of Panksepp's work, and probably yours as well, it's like you're tickling the little rats with your finger, but you read it in scientific language. And one quote that stands out is like, vigorous stimulation of the dorsal surface. It's like you have to translate something like the rats are laughing and tickling into something like ultrasonic vocalizations of positive affect.
Hmm. Yeah, sure.
So how did, to your knowledge, this first start being popularized as something we need to study seriously?
Well, there's sort of two parts to an answer to your question. One is that play has been recognized as a phenomenon that needs explanation way back in ancient Greece. In Plato made some references to play and so on. In the modern era, it really started at the turn of the 20th century, where people started looking at animal behavior seriously and noticed that, well, some animals engage in this peculiar stuff that became labeled play. And so there was several decades of gradually accumulating information on play behavior across a diverse range of species. And the book that really launched the modern era of studying animal play behavior was published in 1981 by a chap called Robert Fagan, who was a faculty member at the University of Illinois at the time, and then spent most of his life in Alaska in Juneau. And that sort of brought to the wider attention that there is this large, rich phenomenon out there distributed across all kinds of animals that needs explanation. It was in the early eight, 1980s that Panksepp started dabbling with trying to understand what the emotional substrates of our behavior and other animals' behavior is all about. And that's when he started focusing on play being one of the important features of that emotional life that we have. And so he started exploring the neuroscience behind the play and other neural systems and other emotional systems. So for a long time, the kind of comparative play kind of domain that um, Fagan launched, and the kind of focused neuroscience work that Panksepp launched sort of went their own separate ways for a long time. And it's only been in this century that really the two have started coalescing, and we're starting to see some cohesion in the play literature, at least for non-human animals.
At first
So it's
glance,
a
when you're
story.
thinking about play from an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't make the most sense because you're thinking, well, this isn't getting you food, you're not reproducing, it's like you're just wasting energy. Shouldn't it be more adaptive to just kind of like sit still unless you really need to use your energy for something survival related? And I know for predators, some people might talk about play as if you're play fighting, it's kind of like early practice for hunting. But rodents play, and a lot of social animals that aren't carnivorous play. So there's a more social element to it.
Yes, correct. And what one of the early theories for why animals play and humans play was proposed by a guy called Carl Groos back in the late part of the 18th century. In two books he published, one called The Play of Humans and The Play of Animals, both in the 1890s. And one of the things that he proposed was exactly what you said, that young animals play as a way of practicing the skills that they will need as adults. Okay. And in fact, that theory, as you've just articulated it, is still pervasive amongst a lot of a lot of scientists and amongst lay people. You just have to watch a nature documentary to hear that story being told. And yet there's extremely little, if any, evidence that that actually is what play does for animals. So
Mhm.
it's just not true. That as our conversation will progress, you'll see that yeah, there are things, some things that play does provide benefits for, but it doesn't provide an explanation for why all the animals that we see play, and what actually, how you extract those benefits emerge is a rather more complicated story than Bruce's practice hypothesis.
We talk a lot about proximate biological causes versus ultimate evolutionary causes, and you don't necessarily have to be thinking about, I'm going to play in fights because I'm gaining skills for my future. Children aren't thinking about that, but they play because it's fun. And then people kind of work backwards from that thinking, well, this must have evolved to be fun because it's adaptive somehow. And I guess that isn't true. So why does it turn out to be fun? Why is it rewarding in our brain?
Yeah. So as we've grown to understand more about how the brain regulates play behavior, the regulation is based on tapping into reward systems in the brain. And those reward systems are present in virtually everything we do, right? Because you can
Hmm.
make the same argument about, well, why do we find eating pleasurable? Well, because if we don't eat, we'll die. Why do we find sex pleasurable? Well, if we don't have sex, we won't have children, and so we'll die out as a lineage, right? So that there are reward mechanisms in the brain that enable us to do two things. One, they induce us to want us to do things that turn out to be, in most cases, useful to us, such as eating and sex. And also, in order to make sure that we keep doing those parts of those activities that are most important, we end up liking doing it, right? So not
Hmm.
only do you eat because you're hungry and you're motivated, but you actually enjoy the process of eating. Now, those systems are true for everything we do, including play. But, and this is where perhaps the conversation about why play will unfold, is that those same systems that reward us to do valuable things are also the same systems that end up making us drug addicts.
Hmm.
And no one that I know of has made the argument that, well, obviously people like taking drugs to excess, therefore there must be an adaptive benefit to drug taking and becoming an addict, right? Rather, the more logical um, approach to this is that somehow, in certain situations, those naturally occurring reward systems in our brains end up being co-opted by some feature of the world that ends up using those to reward us to continue doing actually maladaptive behavior. And so, one thing about the possibility is that in many animals, what we regard as play is just uh, a maladaptive byproduct of the way our brain is wired in order to find doing things, certain things rewarding.
Mhm.
And in most cases, probably the costs are so minimal that it's it's more costly to eliminate that play behavior than to leave some of it there. And in some cases, as hopefully we'll get to eventually, though that play can be co-opted and exaggerated in certain ways to actually provide adaptive benefits. So
Mhm.
so just because we do things that we like doesn't mean that they're necessarily adaptive.
In the drugs example, we have a very mechanistic explanation. So, like, for example, opiates will increase dopamine release, and that is what mediates our feeling of subjective reward. So, even if it's not adaptive in the strict sense to consume the drug, it's the same reward chemical. And play
Mhm.
must be doing the same thing. It releases dopamine, but for the drug, it's literally just a mechanism. And we know that it's sort of hijacking our dopamine system. But why does play have that almost same response?
Yeah, so I mean, there's no agreement amongst play researchers to an answer to that. So I'll give you my idiosyncratic answer, which I think has some merit and a little bit of support. You could probably find others who would find reasons why a different explanation would be important. But one reason is that think of the following. If if you're a lion living in the Serengeti, it on average, it takes about 26 attempts to catch something before you actually catch something to eat, right?
Mhm.
So if you think of things in a purely utilitarian kind of way, you go, well, why do you go out hunting? Because you're hungry and you get a steak to eat at the end of your hunt, right? But if it takes 26 times, which could take 1 or 2 weeks to achieve, this animal is not getting rewarded for for going out and hunting by the actual food, right? So that means the only way you can get this animal to go out and go hunt again, even though your past experience is that it was unrewarding, is that the actual act of hunting is in and of itself a rewarding behavior, right?
Mhm.
A lot of humans like hunting because we come from a lineage of species that hunted, and you do not have to go out and shoot a deer in order to put food on the table. You can just go to the supermarket and buy a steak, right? So one thing about how we're built is that we enjoy doing things for the sake of doing them. And I think that's where play comes in, that it's an expression that in certain situations where animals don't have other problems to deal with, well, rather than sitting there and doing nothing, like you said earlier, it's, well, I don't like doing nothing. I like doing something. And now I'm going to engage in something I enjoy doing irrespective of what benefits I get from doing it other than the immediate reward.
Right. And hypothetically, any animals that didn't have that joy of pursuit might have just died out. They'd hunt 25 times and fail and give up.
Exactly. Exactly.
So that seems also related to boredom and our what is it the hedonic treadmill where you kind of just anytime you get a new reward, like even if you win the lottery, that just becomes your new baseline and you flatten out, so you're only happy for a temporary amount of time.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Um, and indeed, there's because as well as the sort of natural selection argument you gave earlier that, well, if you expend all this time and effort, it's got to be somehow translated into an adaptive benefit. The same argument occurred in most of the 20th century with the advent of of learning theories dominating psychology is that, well, the only reason you do something is because you get rewarded for it, right? And even people studying animals in a very confined space, like rats and pigeons in Skinner boxes, being rewarded to do certain behavior, a continuous puzzle emerged where, okay, so this pigeon in order to get this food reward, has to peck this disc 10 times. But then the damn pigeon pecks 50 or 100 times more than it needs, right? Suggesting that, hey, the peck is not just being performed for the immediate food reward, but the actual pecking itself is somehow rewarding to the animal. And I think that is, again, part of this puzzle, that in order to build a system that is willing to go out and do the things we need to do in order to survive and reproduce, you have to build us in a way that is not immediately tied to what the external rewards are. We need to want to do stuff. And so boredom, I think, is part of that situation where if you've got nothing going on, well, then you have to create to do something, because otherwise you're going to go crazy.
There's a
And
lot of related research on dopamine working more so through prediction than through consumatory reward. I did a recent podcast with Wolfram Schultz, and we were talking about dopamine and prediction error. It's kind of related to this hedonic treadmill idea we talked about, where if you have a new high prediction and then you just get something mediocre, even if it's still fine, rather than just being satisfied with the mediocre reward, you actually might be disappointed if you were expecting more. And then conversely, even if you don't have the reward yet, if you feel like you're predicting the probability that you get it is going up and up as you take steps towards it, that itself is intrinsically rewarding.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's pretty abstract at the human level, but we know that this is true at least in rodents and maybe even in simpler animals. What does it look like developmentally? How early on do animals begin to play or engage in exploration just for the sake of it?
Yeah. So again, it's you have to be careful in sort of making a blanket statement about animals. It
Hmm.
depends on the animals, right? So here's a bit of a problem. If you're a sheep, you, pretty much within a couple of hours of being born, you're fully mobile, and you start showing signs of exploratory activity around your mother. You start showing signs of playful activity such as bounding, galumphing, and so on near your mum. Okay. But if you're something like a rat, you're born in a very altricial state. So you're about this big, you're pink, you don't have any hair, your eyes are closed, your ears are closed, you you can't thermoregulate, so you're pretty much helpless, and you're not going to start exploring. And for something like a rat, it takes about 2 weeks to start getting the animal well enough equipped with the motor and sensory machinery it needs in order to start exploring its surroundings, start seeing if there are things that are interesting to eat beyond the mother's milk, and so on. And it's not until about the later parts of the 3rd week of life that they start directing activities that are recognizably play to their peers or to the environment. So, the time frame of development differs depending on the kind of lifestyle and developmental life history that animals have.
When is the equivalent of puberty in rats?
So for rats, they they tend to be able to fully function as independent animals, not dependent on their mums, in by about 24 days of age, so 24 days post birth, and they're not showing signs of um, internal genital maturation until about 40 to 45 days post birth. And certainly in terms of being able to be fully functioning sexually, doesn't occur until about 60, 70 days post birth. So
Hmm.
you've got at least from 24 days to 45 days where you're mature enough to function on your own, but you're not mature enough to do anything really meaningful sexually. And then there's a period of 1 or 2 weeks where that sexual maturation fully comes into play. So we're sort of looking at 24 to 45 as being the juvenile period, which is defined as an animal capable of looking after itself, but not sexually mature. And then adolescence is the next week or so, as you're now starting to mature your sexual system and
Mhm.
starting to behave, in a sexually adult way.
So for the first week or 2, they're kinda completely helpless, like human infants, and then after that, they're not independent, so I guess they're still nursing, but they can move around and play, so that's almost like you're going on play dates, but then you have to
Yeah,
return to mom for milk, and
yeah.
then the next 2 weeks after that or so, they're like early teenagers, so they can go out and explore and play and forage, but they're not sexually mature at all. And then they're
Yeah,
like late teenagers where they're doing all that, and maybe beginning to have sex, but not fully mature. And then by 2 months, they're adults.
yeah.
How
That's
long do
about
they live?
uh, in captive situations, about 2 years.
Mhm.
So if you're a rat, you got 1 good year in you, and then after that, things starts falling apart. And by 2 years, most rats, even in captivity, where they're protected from predators and given food daily and medical checks, they're coming down with atherosclerosis, cancers, and so on. So,
Uh-huh. So that's interesting. I guess this might have to do with our protracted period of brain development. Because best case with all the medicine, human lives like 100 years, and even that's a little bit unrealistic. And if we say the first 18 or so is still maturing, that's like 18% of our life. And then for a rat, only 2 months out of potentially 2 years are maturing. So that's a much smaller proportion.
mhm. Yeah, and there is a correlation between the size of the brain and the length of the immature period. So the larger the brain, it takes longer to fully mature, because you need that extra time to get all the brain wiring set up, and so you you have to delay sexual maturity a bit longer in order to get that somatic um, wiring up, particularly of the brain, established before you get the sexual maturity. And I hate to disappoint you, but there are some parts of our brain that that actually will figure importantly in our ongoing discussion, that for humans that takes about 25 to 30 years before they're fully mature. So
Yeah, I'm just barely getting there. Now, does the type of play that rats engage in beginning at 2 weeks versus when they're late adolescence, does it change a lot, or is it more or less the same type of play?
yeah, so towards the end of the beginning and end of the third week, a lot of the play that they engage in involves what's called locomotor rotational play. So you're sitting there, and then spontaneously you jump up, run across the room, take a twirl, and run somewhere else, right? And so it's not very much oriented towards peers. But then
Uh,
towards the end of the third week, beginning of the fourth week, virtually all their play, even some of this locomotor play, is geared towards engaging peers. And so the vast majority of play in rats in that juvenile period, where they're the most playful, involves rough and tumble play. They're basically engaging in play fighting together.
I know you've written a lot about these social cues for how play is initiated, and it's so interesting that really across mammals, it seems kinda obvious, like, even in dogs, you kinda just you do this sort of crouching jump, like, you just act all jumpy, and you could imagine someone being scared of that, but pretty universally, you can tell that's an indication for play, and I don't even know how we do it, it almost seems unconscious.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I spent a lot of my career studied not only rats, but a diversity of animals playing, to sort of get comparative perspectives, not to become overly focused on, if a rat does it, then everybody does it kind of mentality. And early on, what the two species I worked on most intensively rats, laboratory rats and laboratory hamsters, right? And in in the early stages, I was using handheld camera to sort of track the and animals and film them. And the thing with rats, you could tell exactly what you just described. The animal makes this jerky movement, and you go, "Yeah, it's going to start running and finding somebody to play with immediately after, right?" And you can sort of end up anticipating. So you, and again, this is way back many decades. You know, you could see your film. Your After you get a sense of these cues from the rats, your camera anticipates where they're going to go, and so you always got them nicely in the middle of the frame. With hamsters, they show no such jerkiness in their behavior. They're just like in the cage. They're two. You've got two animals, and they're just walking around like ships in the ocean. They don't
Mhm.
do anything with one another. They don't show any of these jerky things. And then occasionally, one animal will bump into the other, and they'll get into a rough and tumble play fight. And there's no way of anticipating it because there's none of these cues. Even these cues, they're not universal.
I
Which
know
again,
in
one of so
rodents.
one of the things I want to stress here is that, you know, play is a pretty diverse kind of phenomenon, and we have to be really careful not to use one specific type of play in one specific animal to try to make that the universal pattern that needs to be explained. You really have to take the diversity into account to get what the underlying meta processes are.
And one thought is in rodents, if it's so jumpy and obviously playful, and you can call any rough and tumble play. And then in hamsters, one could imagine the scenario you just described. They bump into each other and then they start wrestling. And how do you know it's not a real fight? But I know you and others have done a bunch of work on coding, like specifically how you can tell the difference between play wrestling and real wrestling. And they they assume different postures that make it easier to win, right? Like they flip each other around more often than they would. Whereas I guess in a real fight, you're really trying to stay on top and be dominant the whole time.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. So in order to, because we because rats mostly do rough and tumble play, which resembles fighting, we we ended up having to spend a lot of time studying real fights in real rats and real other animals, and in order to be able to decipher, well, what are they doing that may be different? Because one possibility, and some people have argued that, you know, what we're labeling as play is just immature uh, fighting behavior. So if it's not, there has to be some objective way of discriminating it. And you're right. What ends up discriminating it is that in a serious fight, what you're going to do is your actions are always going to be two things. One, to deck the other person, hit them, bite them, do whatever is species typical, and incorporate some actions that prevent the opponent from retaliating. In play fights, the opposite seems to be true. Yeah, many of the actions performed can be interpreted in this attack and defense kind of framework, but then in play, the animals throw in some actions that actually handicap them from being able to successfully attack or successfully defend against the other animal's counterattack. Something you never see in a real fight.
Mhm. And you've also written a lot about the idea of dominant or subordinate rats. So I guess like a lot of other social mammals, they're hierarchical. And sometimes dominance is predicted literally just by physical body size, and the bigger dominant one can usually win. And one thing I found was interesting is the subordinate rats are usually the ones who initiate play, whereas for a lot of the things, dominant animals are the ones calling the shots.
Hmm. Yeah. So this leads us to another feature of play, that in some animals, play continues to be a useful tool into adulthood as a way of negotiating social relationships with um, peers, and rats turned out to be one of those species. So again, I'll use the contrast with hamsters, where hamsters, once they leave the maternal nest, they go and live a solitary lifestyle, and the only other time they meet up with another hamster is during courtship and mating, and when the mother is rearing a litter. But otherwise, they're solitary animals. And in hamsters, that's exact what you described is exactly what happens. In a litter of hamsters, the hamster that later on shows clear signs of being dominant is the one that mostly initiates play with its peers. In rats, it's the opposite. And and again, if you look at, well, in hamsters, once they leave the maternal nest, they never play again. With rats, once they mature into young adults, they will continue some degree of play with peers of similar age in their colony. And the play for rats is used in two ways as young adults. One is to reinforce the relationship I have with someone. So if I'm living in a colony where you're the dominant animal, I'm going to direct a lot of affiliative behavior towards you, which is going to include things like come up to you and groom you, and come up to you and engage in social play with you. Basically, I'm using the play and the grooming as a way of telling you I'm recognizing you as the dominant. Alternatively, if I'm a subordinate, but I am sort of, you know, I think I could become the dominant guy here. Now I'm going to come and play with you. I'm going to initiate play, but I'm going to play with you a little bit more roughly and see whether you will tolerate my greater degree of roughness. If I do, I can keep pushing the envelope until eventually we reverse roles. So these are social functions of play in older animals, but in rats, that is not present in hamsters. And in
Mhm.
a survey we did of what did we study about 30 plus primate species, we found that about 50% of them retain this social play in adulthood, and they use it in these social assessment and relationship management roles. And since then, colleagues of mine like Elisabetta Pelagi in Italy has added more and more species to this list that actually continue using play as a tool for social relationship management in adulthood. So again, it depends. So depending on what the life history of that play is in that particular species will determine how it's expressed in young animals.
Peterson, this psychologist that I mentioned, he's argued that this use of play for navigating social relationships in rats and in primates and leading up to in humans was a form of emergent morality in evolution, not only because as social creatures, we have morals and there are rules for play and morals are kind of like different rules, but also because of this handicapping element that you mentioned. And he cites a study, I think it was one of your own, that in addition to the dominant during play having to handicap themselves, that if they don't and if they're too aggressive, then the subordinates might just refuse to play. So there has to be this sort of negotiation of if you're too harsh on the little rat that you can just beat up, then play doesn't get to continue, and there's almost like an ethic in that.
Yeah, 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 and well, that sort of leads to two features of play that I think are important, at least for some animals that use this for useful benefits like negotiating relationships. One is that you do have this rule-based game, and you as an individual playing with other individuals have to decide how much of a transgression are you willing to allow your partner to have. Okay, so if you are dominant and you're transgressing somewhat on the rules with a subordinate, the subordinate probably got a greater a lower, sorry, a higher threshold before it reacts negatively to your transgression. If you're dominant, probably your threshold is lower, but both animals will have a threshold. And so you're right. At some point, a subordinate's going to say, "Okay, you just pushed this too far, and I'm going to respond in an aggressive manner to your transgressions." So, so reciprocity is could be construed of as a sort of an emergent form of morality where there are rules to follow, and morality is following certain rules of what's appropriate and inappropriate behavior. And but there's flexibility in there. And it's that flexibility that I think is really crucial for two things. One, for that negotiation of social relationships, because you can use that wiggle room as a way of pushing the boundaries to see how far you can go. No different to the way young kids push the boundaries with their parents to see
Mhm.
how far they can push the rules. Same thing, but because it is play, you also got a way out saying, "Oh, sorry, I I hit you too hard. I didn't mean to. I was just overexcited by the situation." So you got a way of backing down from if that transgression leads to a negative outcome. And the second thing that is important in the juvenile period, because you got this wiggle room where the animals have to continually assess what the partner's doing, what I'm doing, how's this interaction been going, how many times have I succeeded in subduing the other animal, how many times have it been able to subdue me. It's actually provides a fantastic training ground for a lot of the executive functions that we have that enable us to make um, much more effective decisions about what we do in any particular situation, particularly social ones.
Right, that's a great tie-in to the neurobiology of play because I've read a bunch of studies showing that not only that play seems necessary for healthy brain development, and if you socially isolate rodents or specifically isolate them from play, then as you mentioned, the executive functioning doesn't develop properly. But it also seems to be a critical period around it because if you isolate an adult, their brain really isn't impacted, but it's during this juvenile period, like you mentioned.
Yeah. So um, what we found is that there's a well, we didn't find this, but there's a time period where the prefrontal cortex is maturing, and that happens to coincide with that juvenile period in rats, and and later childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood in humans, right? And it's that same time period where all this rough and tumble play is most frequent, and the form of the rough and tumble play really exaggerates the occurrence of these decision-making moments where you have to decide, should I self-handicap myself because I've been winning too much, if I want to keep my partner engaged in play and so on. So you're really forcing that prefrontal cortex to do its job, right? It's not fully mature, but you're forcing it to work. And and if you deny rats the opportunity to play in that juvenile period, then you get two things happening. At the end of it, their social competency skills are compromised. They're not as good. And secondly, the anatomy and the physiology of the prefrontal neurons has been altered. So suggesting that that play is feeding into the development of this area of the brain and the associated skills that are importantly tied to those brain mechanisms.
Right. Now, I do adolescent brain development in humans and I study cognitive control. So this is what led me down this rabbit hole of
I
your
see.
research and Pankseps and a lot of other rodent research on social development and on puberty in particular. And I know there are a lot of sex differences that you see in play, and some of them might be puberty driven, some might be driven by prenatal hormones. Like when we're talking about rough and tumble play, I think across all species that do it, it's more common in males, or at least males are doing it more aggressively. And that's linked to prenatal androgen exposure. Maybe we could talk about that first and then get to how it changes around puberty.
Yeah, so again, that seemed to be the way things were unfolding, when I was first starting to look at early development of play, the role of uh, perinatal hormonal influences and so on. But it turned out to be a little bit more complicated. So what you have is, so let's break this down into bits. In the standard approach, you have, okay, if you look at the peak juvenile period and you compare female rats and male rats, on average, male rats hit a higher peak in how much play they engage in than females. Okay.
Mhm.
If you manipulate um, testicular hormones in the perinatal period, either by castrating the male or injecting the female with testosterone, you can lower the male juvenile peak down to that of the female by eliminating the testes, or you can elevate the female um, level of play to that of typical of males by giving her testosterone early on. So all that sounds good, but then it turned out to be a little bit more complex than that, because whether you get these hormone induced effects that are measurable at the level of behavior depends on the kind of um, rearing environment the animals have. So studies that have shown this sex difference have generally been done in contexts where the young animals in are actually being reared in groups with groups of partners, and most strongly if those groups of partners contain both males and females. When you raise just a pair of rats together from weaning to the peak juvenile period, so you now have a pair of females or a pair of males, then when you look at their play at that peak juvenile period, often you don't get any sex difference at all. So so clearly
Mhm.
that early organizational influence of those hormones is critical for shaping what your potential is, but whether that potential is expressed or not is going to depend on the rearing environment. So so that's one complication. The second complication is that at puberty, um, males switch to using rougher tactics in how they defend themselves against a playful attack. Females tend to retain the tactics more typical of juveniles. So you can think of, okay, so the females are staying more juvenile-like, the males are becoming more adult-like. And indeed, if you remove the gonads of males in the perinatal period, and then you look at what the age at which they would normally hit puberty, you fail to get this shift in how they play. They just keep playing like juveniles and so like females. But if you inject females with testosterone in the perinatal period, when they hit that pubertal age, they do not show the shift. They continue playing in the juvenile typical form. However, if you ovariectomize the females perinatally, or indeed just before they hit puberty, they will show the male typical transition. So it looks
Mhm.
like that for at least this part of the age change, the females and males are not showing sort of the opposite of one another. So the female is not the default condition for the male, but rather the female is actively maintaining that juvenile typical pattern of play because of an active role of ovarian hormones suppressing that shift. So
Uh-huh.
that complicates the pattern of development of how, you know, defining what is a sex difference and so on.
If you give the males estrogen during that period, you see that active suppression effect and they behave more female-like as well?
No, the only way you suppress it in males is to get rid of the testes.
Uh-huh. So it seems like then it's two processes working because when you mention the ovarectomy in females, that's not removing the ovaries and then pumping them full of testosterone. Removing the female hormones are sufficient.
Yep, yep, yeah, which surprised the hell out of me. So I was working
Uh-huh.
with graduate students, and we had to do the experiment multiple times because I was convinced
Uh-huh.
one of you has done something wrong here
Yeah,
because I was
the
not
female
expecting.
hormones have been trickier for me to understand. You see all these classic stories about organizational effects of
Mm,
androgens, and my sense is it's almost like a historical analog to how people talk about sexual selection. For so long, the focus was only on the males because it's much more obvious how they compete. But then clearly there are these subtle ways that female sexual selection is operating with choosiness, and I imagine the hormones are doing similar subtler things.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think that that classical picture is generally true, but you can't assume that every feature of a female and every feature of a male follows that classical mechanism. There are
Right.
some active roles that hormones have in the development of some female characteristics, for sure.
No, at least in humans, and I think in primates, in large social groups, children pretty spontaneously uh, group into male and female groups. Do you see the same thing with rodents?
Yeah, there's only been one serious study looking at the development of play in multi-male, multi-female litters, and what that showed is that in the juvenile period, they're pretty much indiscriminate as to who they play with, but then as they hit towards puberty, the females stop being as interested in playing with the males, and that's probably because the males are shifting to this rougher form of play. So
Hmm.
with some sexual bias as to who you play with, but that may be an indirect effect of the kinds of play that they're mostly engaging in. But certainly, if you just have a male and female pair reared together during the juvenile period, they'll both play up a storm. So
I thought you might have said the opposite, that same-sex play goes down during puberty, maybe thinking that play would be something like initiating what could turn into sexual behavior.
yeah, again, those studies haven't been done, but it's quite possible that the males become more interested in the females, but then the females become less interested in the males because the ensuing play is not as rewarding to them. It's
Mhm.
not as fun.
Because you could tell both like a positive and negative story. I'm sure both are true. That the negative version would be something like males get more aggressive around puberty, especially with each other, because it's practice for intrasexual competition and they're establishing rank and they have to be more aggressive to do that. And then indirectly, that's going to have sexual benefits. Another way to think of it when we're talking more about like this emergent morality and the cortical maturation and you're behaving more pro-socially and you're negotiating rank, all of those things seem more like they could uh, facilitate your sexual opportunities in this more pro-social way.
Yeah, yeah, and like you say, but both could be true. They're not mutually exclusive processes.
Uh-huh. So I look at this and I really want to try and generalize it to humans, and especially talking about play and the effects of social isolation on brain development, harmful effects. We're not completely isolated, but today's generation, like with how much time we spend on screens and also with COVID, there's less social engagement than we historically have had. Do you think that that's harmful on human brain development as well?
Yeah, yeah, I do. So before I stick my neck out and answer that, can I just go back to the male and female
Uh-huh.
issue in rats?
Yeah.
Because I think it's an important thing to clarify here. We we have now done the experiment where we found a way of giving both juvenile males and juvenile females equivalent amounts of play deprivation. And what we found was that in both sexes, the absence of the play, or the changed character of the play that we exposed them to, had an impact on both the development of the prefrontal cortex and on the development of social skills. So I think one thing needs to be made clear: both males and females can benefit from the play experience in terms of brain development and skill development.
Mhm.
It's not that, this is really important for males and not important for females. No, both have it. Now, there's another lab run by Margaret McCarthy in the US, where she and her group have been looking at sex differences in development. And they've recently done a nice big review showing that some of the cognitive skills that are impacted in females differ from some of the cognitive skills impacted in males. So I think growing lesson is that, yeah, play in this juvenile period for some animals like rats, and we'll get to humans, is important for this particular kind of brain development. But there may well be sex differences in which aspects of those skills are most impacted by the play. So that's to sort of get the rat story out a little bit more fully. Now, in terms of humans, my gut feeling is that's absolutely true. That the reduction in opportunity to engage in in free play with your peers has had a negative impact on our development of these social and executive function skills that we've been talking about in rats. And uh, Peter Gray has done a nice job of documenting since the Second World War, looking at what kinds of problems um, children and teenagers have, and he's shown that over the decades there's been this increase in psychopathologies, things like depression, um, drug taking, uh, feelings of alienation, blah blah blah, all these things.
Mhm.
And at the same time, there's this correlated decline in the opportunity to engage in play with your peers during this childhood or juvenile period. So the correlation's there. Now, the question is whether there is a causal connection between the two. And again, I think there are there are small bits of evidence to suggest that there is a causal relationship. So, for example, there was a nice study by a group in the Netherlands a few years ago where they looked at children, because you can't obviously do experimentally induced isolation
Mhm.
studies with humans, right? But what they did was they looked at kids that were, for no fault of their own, enforced into being isolated from peers because they're in hospital with some chronic disease that prevents them from interacting with peers. And
Mhm.
then compared those with their siblings of comparable age who are out in the world interacting with peers. And they looked at things like the several aspects of executive functions in the kids at the beginning of this process, and then after several months of either being in hospital or being out in the world. And uh, the kids that were out in the world doing things like engaging in play had had a had an upward trajectory of improvement in the executive function skills that was higher in the ones that were in hospital. So not an experiment, but still indicative, that there is some effect here. And in other situations where people have been trying to sort of see if you can improve executive functions with play experiences in a school setting, there have been several studies. One group is by Adele Diamond in University of British Columbia. Another group is at my home university, run by Robert Gibb in my department. And they've sort of come up with programs where you provide kids with greater opportunity for engagement in play for some period of time, and you compare what their executive function skills are at the beginning of the study and at the end. And those that have gone through the play experiences have a higher trajectory in the development of social skills, of executive function skills.
Mhm.
And most critically for what we're talking about here is it's the biggest effect has been social play. So yeah, you get some improvement with playing by yourself, but improvement you get from social play is much greater. So you sort of put all these things together and you go, okay, and given the animal research we now have, and you get these little nuggets from the human research, you go, the most plausible and parsimonious explanation is that humans are showing similar patterns to what we've shown causally in rats. That the play is actually benefiting the development of these executive functions, which are dependent on the prefrontal cortex.
Now that you're describing all this, I wonder if similar studies have been done looking at homeschool. The interesting thing about that would be it's almost more experimental in that you could probably find cohorts of kids who did it their entire lives or only for the early grades or maybe only for middle school or high school. And then what you could do there is see if the effects are limited to a specific age window.
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course you can also add to that by, I mean, some parents who are keenly aware of the potential importance of play for their children, if they homeschool, they also create opportunities to make sure that there are play dates with peers
Right.
versus one that, you know, you're home, forget about interacting with all these other bozos. You just concentrate on learning. So even within that group, you could have break it down into subcategories where you can really tease out the influence of those peer-peer interactions.
Are there any equivalents in rodent research or other animals of something like now imagine a human child is placed into a new school and they have plenty of opportunities for socialization, but they're not really integrated in the social group as much as if they were raised in that environment. So humans can be exclusionary. Do you see the same thing with rodents where if you pop one into a new group of stranger rodents, even if they can socialize, it's not as beneficial?
Yeah, so Rabbi said one approach we've had to try to equalize the kinds of play experiences that female and male rats get in order to see the consequences of those altered play experience on development.
Mhm.
Well, it, it indirectly ends up touching on this, and I've got a graduate student at the moment who's exploring this very question. The way we did it was by rearing together rats of of a particular strain that we know very well, the Long Evans hooded rats, with um, with a peer from another strain, which at the time we used because other researchers claimed that these rats are less playful, and that's the Fisher 344 rat. And when you rear those together, you it turned out if you look at it from the point of view of the Long Evans rat, when it grows up, it has impoverished social skills and it has altered um, neural wiring of the prefrontal cortex. But then we found that if we look at it from the point of view of the Fisher 344 rat, it shows impoverished social skills and altered wiring of the prefrontal cortex. So the problem is that these rats are not able to really get those coordinate their play in a way to produce those reciprocity experiences that seem so critical to developing these skills. So we're starting to look at rats in groups where we want to know, okay, if you're given a choice, who are you going to play with? And it turns out initially our initial work is with Long Evans rats. And even within a group of long Evans rats, even ones that grow up together, some are just seem to be just more likable than others. And
Mhm.
there's, there's some rat in the group that nobody wants to play with. There's some rat in the group that everybody wants to play with, and other ones that, yeah, if no one else is around, I'll play with you. That's fine, right? And using that model, we're now starting to look at, well, what happens when we put rats of different strains where they have slightly different styles of play? Do they do they choose animals of particular properties to exclude? And the little bit of preliminary data we have is that, yeah, if given a choice, a long Evans rat will just not play with a Fisher rat, and a Fisher rat will just not play for long Evans rat. If
Mhm.
you, as an alternative, something like a Wistar or Sprague-Dawley rat, then the long Evans rat will go, yeah, look, if given a choice, I'd rather play with a long Evans rat. But, if a Wistar comes around, I'll play with the Wistar. But I'll only play with the Fisher as a last resort. So there does seem to be some basis by which animals choose who they find most rewarding to play with, and trying to now unravel, well, what are the things you're using to make that selection is really critically important, because again, it's got a translational value of, and I mean, we were all kids, so I remember being in schoolyard that shit, there are some kids that, nobody really likes interacting with, either
Mhm.
because they're wussy or too bullish. There's something about them that's not right. And so being able to identify, well, what are the properties that selection is based on, could certainly help teachers and school counselors figure out, okay, how we're going to integrate this kid better into the school ground, than if we know what the other kids are not finding appropriate about their behavior.
Do you think in rodents these are more personality based or looks based? As in maybe the one who's harder to play with is a big introvert, or maybe they're ugly, or maybe the popular one is sexy, but humans just can't see it. Like, have anyone tried to sort of quantify, maybe even with facial recognition AI, like what makes a mouse's face more attractive to another mouse and like use that to predict mating success or something like that?
Yeah, yeah, not yet, but we're starting to see research come out that is not in the play context, which is what we hope to push it into, but into other social domains where, um, rats will tend, if they're paired with members of their own group, they will tend to favor doing things with members that look similar to members of their group in another social context, right? So there is this, visual difference. And again, this is why things like long Evans hooded rats are really nice, because they've got a white body and a black head and a black hood on the top, whereas a lot of other laboratory rats are pure white. So you really can't distinguish them at a distance as to who they are. But even having said that, there are experiments showing that a long Evans rat, yeah, if I've got a choice as to, say if I scare a long Evans rat, and now here you've got a choice of who you can go and seek comfort from. Okay, like rats do what we do. When you're scared or sad, getting comfort from another person is is quite nice. It's a way of calming you down. And rats do the same thing. So you now have, okay, scare a long Evans rat or make it anxious. Where does it seek comfort? And if you give it a choice, say between another long Evans, a Wistar, and a Fisher, it will prefer the long Evans, even if it doesn't know that long Evans. So it doesn't have to be someone that they are personally familiar with. If that long Evans is not available, then yeah, it'll go to the Wistar. But the Wistar is pure white, just like the Fisher. So it can't just be on looks. Okay, so we'll get into some other possibilities of that. And only if no one else is available will I go and seek succour with the fisher? So this rat is certainly not my first choice, right? So yeah, in one case, you could recognize it on visual grounds, but clearly on these two white rats, you can't distinguish them on some obvious visual thing. So there are some possibilities. One is like you suggested, there could be some facial gesturing, but you can also run this experiment in the dark and you get the same effect. So the vision can't be the sole thing. Yeah. Some other possibilities are that there are odors that you're using. And one of the things about Long Evans and Wistar is that even though they've been two separate strains for about 100 years, they actually came from a common origin, whereas fishes were developed much later from a separate lineage of rats, so they don't share an, a close genetic um, genealogy with these other two rats. So it's possible that since rats are very olfactory animals, that there are pheromones that you can detect and say, yeah, you're most familiar to me. I'm going to come to you. You smell close enough. You'll do. And you really don't smell right. So I'm only going to come to you as a last resort. Another possibility is they make ultrasonic vocalizations. The patterns of ultrasonic vocalizations they emit may register as these are ones I recognize most clearly. So I'm going to go here. These are the ones that are most alien to me. So I'll only go there if I really have to. So we're in early grounds to really identify what are the cues that are important for making these decisions. But I think we have enough experimental data to show that rats do discriminate. Part of it's based on some objective thing about identity that's independent of my personal experience with them. But there are also some socialization effects. So if you get Long Evans rats reared with Wistar litters, then they will just as likely go to a Wistar rat as to a Long Evans rat for comfort in these sorts of contexts. So clearly, who you're reared with can also influence the decision you're making.
I like the pheromones idea the most because I do hormones research, and it's
Oh,
making me think of the research on how if you're reared with rats, or even this applies in humans, like adopted siblings, it's something about smelling them and growing up with them that once you mature sexually, you're not sexually attracted to them, even if you're not genetically related at all. And I could imagine a similar mechanism, or maybe even the same mechanism, that whether it's by smell or just learning growing up with them in the even though you preferentially aren't sexually attracted to them, you could be sexual or preferentially more inclined to play with them.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
When I describe this type of research to my psychology peers, there's often a lot of pushback and there's several barriers. So one idea would be if talking about how play deprivation impairs brain development, they might say, well, you can clearly show brain differences, but how do you know that's impairment? How do you know it's not just you're adapting to a different strategy? And then you can point to the different types of literal impairments that you talk about. So like they're more anxious or they struggle to play or they struggle to mate or they have decreased food or sex drive, which could look something like depression. And then they might say, well, you call those depression and anxiety like behaviors, but it could be completely different from how it works in humans. And then you talk about some of the pharmacology research in rodents, where if you give them anti anxiety meds or antidepressants like SSRIs, the exact same drugs that work in humans, and it does restore appetite or play or sex drive, then to me, that all seems like pretty strong evidence that it's the very same mechanism working in humans and in rodents.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting because um, since you started this conversation with Panksepp's work, right? The really revolutionary thing that he started pushing was the idea that there are these basic emotions in
Hmm.
what in for him in mammals and explore other vertebrates if you want, but certainly for mammals. And he got a lot of pushback right till when he died that, you know, this is just nonsense. That these are human feelings that got nothing to do with what other animals experience. And, he spent decades showing, yeah, but, if the animal shows rage, here are the neural circuits that are activated. Here are the neurotransmitters involved. They're exactly the same ones as in humans. If you're experiencing lust, here's the neural circuits that are involved and the neurotransmitters are exactly the same. So it's a case, I think, but my own personal feeling is that for some psychologists, it's a case of, well, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's not.
Right.
Then
You
you go,
see the same thing with the oxytocin research in prairie voles. I mean, there's really great evidence that oxytocin facilitates pair bonding. And then if you look into the neurobiology of it, I remember a review paper, it was showing how oxytocin like heightens coupling with the dopamine system. So they described the pair bonding mechanism literally the same as a dopamine addiction mechanism like you do for drugs. So like it's just they smell the pheromones of the mate and they create a strong reward signal and it's like they become addicted rather than opening the door to there's like some subjective positive feeling of love and it's almost a choice because it was just strange to me reading that because if you apply the same idea to humans like you can show in humans how when you interact with a mate oxytocin levels rise and dopamine rises and you just describe all that in terms of well clearly the person isn't actually feeling love it's just hitting them like a drug and almost like a mechanistic you're taking all the free will out of it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't get it. Yeah,
Yeah,
and with psychologists, I find them particularly sort of odd people because you go, okay, so basically you can't use things that look similar to make an argument that they may be the same, right? But the same people have no problem using things that look like animals pressing a lever to get a reward as a behavior showing a conditioning process that is then translated to see humans do exactly the same thing. Well,
Mhm.
but now you're saying similar equals the same, but in this other context, you're saying similar cannot be used to make that same conclusion. So it's a cherry picking kind of process in the evidence that bothers me.
Yeah, I've tried to talk about this to people in my department, especially in cognitive science classes where they're teaching the history going from behaviorism, where there was a time where psychologists were extremely reluctant to talk about any cognitive mechanisms under the hood, especially in animal behavior. And then the cognitive revolution came on, and now we're extremely comfortable talking about decision making in animals, almost like these computational mechanisms. But when it comes to emotion, I would have thought the natural history would have been maybe around the time of Panksepp. Then comes the affective revolution that we talk about animal emotions the same way because they're made of the same stuff. But that hasn't seemed to happen yet, which is really surprising to me.
Yep, yep, I agree, and I'm not quite sure I understand the resistance
And
because
my
it's
advisor jokes that I belong in the evolutionary bio department.
maybe so.
Uh, Sergio, is there anything else about the neurobiology of play that we haven't covered that you want to discuss?
Uh, no, maybe I just want to make one thing really clear. Um, so when we have our Long Evans and our Fisher rats reared together, if you look at the total amount of play they engage in, it's no different to when they're reared with same strain partners, right? So this goes back to that practice kind of idea. So in terms of actually rehearsing the behavior patterns, you're getting the same experience. The difference is that the outcome is different in terms of how you're able to negotiate social situations, right? So your social skills are impaired in one case, not the other. And then when you look at,
Mhm.
well, what are the microstructure differences in what the animals are doing when they're playing? In that mixed brain condition, what you have is The animals simply are much more asymmetrical in their play engagement. That is, the things you do and the things I do don't come close to parity. So in Long Evans or Fisher pairs, you know, differences between pairs in how much they attack, how much they defend, what kind of tactics they use, and so on. There's a margin of about 10% difference across individual pairs. And in these cross-trained situations, the margin is now at about 30 to 40%. So it's not how much of things you do, but the actual negotiating process of being able to coordinate with your partner to produce these coherent um, social interactions that um, are enjoyable to both of you. That really is important. So there really is a psychological training here rather than a physical training going on. So
Mhm.
even though I do psychology, I recognize that there is a psychological domain here which is being influenced, and it's the important experience. It's the important part of the training process. It's not the physical training.
Mhm. This might be a nice a note to end on. So in my lab building, we operate a corner of the wing where they have the neuroimaging facilities, but it's mostly animal neuroscientists and people doing cellular level research. And some of the lab mice escaped, and everyone was freaking out, especially in the psychology wing, because it's like scary rats. But I thought they were kind of cute, and I never felt that way before a couple years ago when I started doing all this rodent neuroscience research and especially the
Uh,
oxytocin research. So I imagine it might have increased your empathy or like sense of connectedness with them, spending decades researching their play behaviors. Is that right?
yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I like the comparative side too. Is spending time at zoos, filming some new species engaging in play, is that at first they sort of seem alien to you, but then as you're spending time with them and trying to film what they're doing, you get that empathy kicking in, and you start anticipating what they're going to do, and they gain a richness of individual individualness of agency that is you can't get except through direct experience.
Hmm. Thank you for sharing, Sergio. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Okay.